Okay, the final stretch now. This is my last lecture for this unit. I'm going to try to speed through this material, but we've got quite a bit of material to cover. And then, of course, we have our discussion in class of William of Tyre. And remember, Tuesday, the entire period is devoted to review. So this is the late Abbasid period. We're going to cover the remaining history of that 500-year Abbasid period, as well as have a look at the Crusades and then some of the cultural accomplishments from that period, including the philosophers. We've already covered the initial flourishing and the Buyid period. Now we're looking at that Saljuk period, which is the end, the last 200 years, covering the Crusaders and the Mamluks and the assassins. So the major political events of this period begin with this takeover by these Saljuk princes. Again, as Berkey points out, this is a confederation of tribes from the area beyond Khorasan, modern-day Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. Those areas are where the Saljuks originate. They eventually take over, defeat the Buyids, and are recognized as Sultan by the Abbasid Caliph. Sultan literally means power or authority. And that was their title while leaving the Abbasid Caliph in place, and in a sense, powerfully reasserting the Sunni control of the Abbasid Caliphate, taking that from the Shiite Buyid princes. The Crusades happen in the beginning of this period, and in some ways the Saljuks initiate the Crusades with their attack and defeat of the Byzantine army in 1171 at the Battle of Manzikert. That's not part of our story, but that is the way the Crusades begin. 1095 with the declaration in Clermont by Pope Urban II, leading to this series of military marches from Europe across the Byzantine Empire, eventually taking Jerusalem in 1099. Saladin is the Muslim hero of the Crusades, still is a celebrated person today in Muslim states, especially in that area of the Middle East. He retakes Jerusalem in 1187 and also takes the Fatimid Empire, takes Egypt from the Fatimid Empire. So this map shows you that the Crusader states were this line of states across the eastern boundary here, eastern shore of the Mediterranean. The Saljuk Empire was smack up against the Crusader states, with Damascus being a major and important city of the Saljuk Empire. And to the south, the Crusaders were next to the Fatimid Empire. So between two different warring states, very much a buffer state between the Sunni Saljuks, who are also the Abbasids, right, and the Fatimid Shiite Caliphate down in Egypt. And then the period ends with the Ayyubids. That's the name given to Saladin's dynasty. He's Saladin ibn Ayyub. Ayyub is his father. And this family of the Ayyubids takes control in Egypt and rules Egypt for about 100 years. They close with the rise of the Mamluks, which is something we're not going to be addressing in this class. Again, very happy to talk about the Mamluks in discussion if you'd like. The Nizaris, which is a branch of the Ismaili Shiite tradition, actually rise out of the Fatimid dynasty. They represent a group that supported a different branch of the Fatimids, one that was not part of the Fatimid dynasty, and undertook this program of assassination to try to promote their view of this branch of Ismaili Shiism. The Nizaris are interesting to us today because they are the historical root of the Aga Khan and the Aga Khan movement within Ismaili Shiism. The devotees of the Aga Khan make up a significant portion of Sevener Shiism today. The Aga Khan is a very well-known philanthropist, supporter of Islamic arts, many things to talk about with the Aga Khan. The Saljuks continued to extend their power into Asia Minor after this initial defeat of the Byzantine Empire in the Battle of Manzikert. And throughout the Crusader period, they keep extending farther and farther into that territory of Asia Minor, eventually establishing another capital in Nicaea. So let's look a bit at these cultural accomplishments from this period. Again, for me, the ideas of war and dynasties are the framework, but the actual thing we're interested in this class is the culture, the civilization of this period. So first of all, some general remarks about education. We talked about Al-Azhar University, established in Cairo in 972 for the purposes of promoting the Ismaili vision of Islam. And with that, also the promotion of astronomy and the study of Qur'an and Hadith. And all these things then became central to the education mission of Al-Azhar University. Here's another view inside the mosque. And these pillars here were in fact classrooms. You can see them set up this way with these lovely rugs. And the teacher, the professor, that is, say, me, I'd sit here on a nice chair with my back against the pillar, and you all as students would be round in front of me in semicircles on this comfortable rug. And as in our class now, the best students are in front, the ones in back who aren't quite sure whether they're engaged or not. So this is the way that things would be organized. But the difference is that I would have my class here at this pillar and somebody else would have their class at that pillar and so on. And so if you're bored with my class, you just kind of go over to the next set of lectures, the next pillar over, a couple of pillars over. So in many ways, this is a kind of controlled chaos. The British found this very upsetting when they took over and they promoted the reform of Al-Azhar University at the end of the 19th century, but that's another story altogether. The Saljuks then, in response to the success of Al-Azhar University, established their own universities. This one named the Nizamiya, after the name of the vizier of the Saljuks, Nizam al-Mulk. It's not his actual name. The name means the organizer of the kingdom. Very powerful, important, and learned man who established not only this madrasa in Baghdad, but several others in important cities throughout the Saljuk area. And this is the beginning of combining these two institutions, the mosque and the madrasa. And we see this played out in architecture itself. Here, looking down into the courtyard of a madrasa mosque, this one built in the Mamluk period, so a little after our period. But you can see here how the architecture itself lends itself to learning. Not only do we have 4 rooms here, this one is also the prayer hall, but these 4 rooms then ideal for a seminar. And in the walls of the mosque itself are living quarters, where student dormitories, where students would live. Now, in this case, there are 4 sets of these, each with its own separate courtyard with a light in the top here. And these were set up for the 4 schools of law. So all 4 of these schools would be supported here. This university, like Penn State, in its founding had an endowment attached to it that was to pay for school books and their food and housing, as well as the salaries of the staff and the professors. Penn State, by the way, also was set up that way initially. Now, of course, it costs a lot of money, but this is progress. Here's another institution, this one a Sufi khanqah. And now we have a modification of the courtyard mosque with this large area where the prayer hall is. But on the side, in the arcade, you can see these doorways which lead to small apartments. So Sufis, as I mentioned in just a second, are mystical devotees. They would live here with their families in the mosque, and the mosque was also then the place where they would have their rituals. So we have these new developing institutions that we can see represented in the surviving architecture in Cairo. And then with this is a literary culture. This is what I spend a lot of my time working on and writing about, and that is this development of a literary society that is based on a pretty broad spread literacy, much more broad spread than we had in the Byzantine Empire or in Europe at that time. And this include the kind of commentaries on religious texts like the Qur'an and the Hadith collections, also scientific texts, whether astronomy or medicine or physics, and then the development of theological systems. So all of this we have examples from in the surviving manuscripts. So let's take a minute and walk through these different intellectual pursuits. And the first I'm going to begin with is Sufism. And Sufism can be defined in a number of ways. On the one hand, it's a kind of mysticism, looking for hidden meanings in the world at large and a sense of ultimate reality. There is a kind of Sufism that talks about light being inherent in all beings, or some sense of shared spirit. There is Sufism defined as devotionalism. So simply taking the devotional practices that are central to Islam, prayer and pilgrimage and fasting, and then raising those up a level. So additional prayers, additional elements of fasting. And in this devotion, there is a central rejection of the material world as being misleading, and in fact, leading one to hell, to perdition, whereas these devotional practices are meant to focus on the spiritual. And so spirituality becomes a third way to think about Sufism. So here, not so much outside the Sharia, but inside the Sharia, a kind of layering on top of the normal practices. So Sufism has a wide variety of meanings, and we can see this represented in a wide variety of Sufi practices. We can also think of this historically, developing through the Quran itself, where there are emphases on extra practices like the night prayer or repeating the name of God, which becomes a dhikr within Sufism, a mantra, if you will. Then there are some individuals who are exemplary Sufis. One, Hassan al-Basri, who was also a governor of Basra, died in 728, and Rabi al-Adawiya, an important female Sufi. So Sufis, because of their devotion to mysticism and their de-emphasis on the material world, also tend to de-emphasize the difference between male and female. So there are many examples of important women who achieved fame and whose writings within the Sufi tradition are remembered. By ascetics, by the way, I'm talking about people who tend to reject the world and who think of material things as being negative. There is also a whole world of what's called theosophical speculation, so trying to put systems together that explain how everything fits together. Al-Hallaj is one example of this, a famous Sufi who was imprisoned and then hung for the claim that he was the ultimate reality. In his speculative understanding, there was no difference between the divine and not divine. Everything was divine. And if everything was divine, well, then he is divine. And there can be no distinction between him and God. Therefore, he is God, right? So you can see where this goes and how the more traditional authorities would have been upset by this. Ibn al-Arabi is a Spanish mystic who said much the same thing, but in a much more complex and clever and systematic way. His many, many writings are preserved for us today. And those who study Ibn al-Arabi attest to not only the complexity, but also the difficulty of understanding his systems, because they were layered in secrets only for the initiated to understand. And then throughout the Islamic world, we have orders of Sufis. I don't really want to bring up a sense of order in the sense of Christian orders of monks and nuns, because again, these are orders that do not require celibacy, and oftentimes do not have a separate monastery or place of worship, though sometimes they did, as I showed you in that one slide. Rather, these are groups of people who share the literature and the stories that belong to particular exemplary saints. So one example is Abdul Qadir Jilani, who founded the Qadiriyya. There are many, many examples of Sufi orders throughout the Islamic world. These are, again, roughly historical in development. The orders really, Jilani is one of the oldest orders. They don't really start until this point, which is right at the end of our time of interest. And the concepts of devotionalism are concepts that we see throughout the Islamic period. Islamic law, likewise, has different phases and can be seen as both present in the Quran as well as developing in very significant ways. We'll have time to talk more about Islamic law. I just want to raise a few questions about Islamic law for you to give you a sense of what category law fits in, because we tend to think of law in terms of traffic laws or business laws, contract laws. Those might be part of Islamic law, but Islamic law includes many, many more things that we might consider ethics or proper practice or just being polite. Islamic law tends to split up all human action into one of five categories. Required actions, things like paying alms or undertaking the pilgrimage if you can afford to. Recommended actions, things that are good to do, but not strictly required. Indifferent, neither good nor bad. And then on the negative side, we have, of course, forbidden, things you may not do that are sins, if you will, as well as actions that are not exactly forbidden, but really kind of bad. So this, in many ways, seems more like an ethical system than a legal system. And also the implementation of these depended on a kind of human interactive process that was very different than what we associate with law in our world in the 21st century. So we can think of Islamic law as we might think of the Tao or the Torah. Sharia, literally in Arabic, would mean the righteous path. And likewise, there's a distinction between the Sharia, that is law as thought of in God's mind as this perfect system and plan for all humankind, and then the application of these ideals in everyday life, and that is fiqh. So a lot of the literature of Islamic law is actually a literature of fiqh, of how to apply these ideals to the nitty-gritty of everyday life. Let's jump now to theology from Islamic law, and all these are related, as I'll show in just a minute. Theology then has some similarities both to Islamic law and to Sufism. It is an attempt to explain God and our beliefs and how our beliefs fit together. So when we're talking about the different Christian views of Jesus as divine or as human, that is theology. It's an attempt to explain, to systematize these various beliefs. Theology arguably is not present at the beginning of a religious tradition, but only develops when that tradition becomes mature or complex, and it already has a history of things that are part of that religious tradition, whether these are practices or whether these are people, exemplary individuals. Theology also develops often in distinction with other religious traditions. So when Muslims face Christians, how do they differ from Christianity? How do they differ from Judaism or Zoroastrianism? To try to explain that is a matter of theology. And then in many ways, this ability, this time that one spends thinking about these things requires a university that supporting individuals that otherwise would be contributing to the economy, supporting them to spend their lives writing and thinking is something that only results in a society that has that excess wealth, that can devote some of that excess wealth to scholarship and to the university. Philosophy, likewise, requires this university structure, requires individuals being able and free to think about things. But philosophy here encompasses not only what we might think of as the big questions of why are we here and what do we do, but also the observable physical universe. This is natural philosophy, which was the same as these other more speculative forms of philosophy that we might think of today. So natural philosophy includes medicine. Natural philosophy includes physics. And I always like to point out that physician and physicist are actually the same word, both focused on physos, on the nature, on natural things that exist. And this, again, led to speculative, systematic thinking that very much shared a worldview with the Sufis and with the theologians. This interaction with Sufism, this interaction with theology, also led to thinking about God within the natural world. And so nature is sometimes referred to as a second book of Revelation. That to know about God, all you need to do is to walk out into nature and to think about where did all this beauty come from and who could have created this natural diversity. The Qur'an often tells people to go out into the world and to see all the things that God has done as a way of learning about God. Ibn Sina thought that the philosopher and the prophet were very much the same, that the philosopher in some ways was superior to the prophet because the philosopher understood the way that knowledge about God, or as he would call it, the active intelligence, fits into the movement of the spheres, the turning of the planets, and the human body. So here we have a kind of map of the universe. And again, here we would say that astrology and astronomy are the same word. So this has then the Earth in the middle, and then all the different spheres that are mentioned moving on out. These are 7 spheres, and so we have 8 levels. The octaves has 7 notes in music. Music and spheres and the body, and all these things were held to be interactive with one another. So therefore, astrology, right? The study of the position of the stars and the influence that the planets could have on the human physiology was understood to be real, that we are connected to our natural world in this way. And so in this sense, the philosophical tradition also connects very closely to the Greek medical tradition, to Indian astronomical tradition, and this sense that knowledge is one, that a philosopher can learn from any of these sources because there is only one world and there is only one God, and so all of it must be referring to the same set of fundamental knowledge. I'm going to leave you here with just thinking about three thinkers as examples. So al-Ash'ari is often thought of as a theologian. He was raised at a time when the influence of the Greek philosophical tradition was very significant. So as a theologian, he is thinking about logic and how God does or does not conform to logic. As a reaction against this notion that God must be rational in the way that we're rational, he argued that God is not bound by our limited notions of rationality, that God's not required to be just in the way that we might think of justice. Ibn Sina, I mentioned just before, very famous as a physician, and in fact, his medical texts were still taught in the Sorbonne University until about 400 years ago. These texts were translated into Latin and to many other languages. But more than a physician, he also was a famous philosopher and theologian. Here, he's an exemplar for us of this Neoplatonic worldview. This is a worldview that, again, was very much shared by Christian and Jewish theologians at the time. Picking up on Plato's metaphor of the cave, there is this idea of the one, which is thought of here as the sun. And this one is the unity from which the active intelligence that moves the world is emanated. And then from this comes the soul or the forms of things that animates plain matter. So matter then being the lowest level. This leads to a mystical speculation of the whole world then and creation itself being an emanation from this one into the sensible world that we live in now, and that the end of time will be a re-aggregation into this one. So many things that we could talk about in terms of the development of these systems. And finally, al-Ghazali, who was a philosopher who in fact taught philosophy at the famous Nizamiya Madrasa in Nishapur, and he rejected philosophy and actually left academia and had a kind of midlife crisis. And at this point, he tried to, and in fact did, reconcile philosophy and theology and Sufi thought in this book called The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin in Arabic. And in this thought, he's combining Ash'ari theology and Sufi thought into one. He's a very important systematic thinker. Many of his writings survive today. For our purposes, we'll be looking at Ibn Tufayl, who comes the generation just after al-Ghazali, very much at the mature point of this philosophical, theological, and mystical tradition. On Thursday, then, we are going to be discussing William of Tyre. Make sure that you take a look at this text so that we can discuss it and think through what's going on here in this period of the Crusades, just to have a chance to dig a little more deeply into a primary source. And then, of course, Tuesday will be a review session. So that's it for this lecture. Hopefully it wasn't too fast, and I look forward to discussing this all with you, as well as the William of Tyre text in class.